So tonight I have two stories to tell you, and they're great stories, but when I was thinking about how I would go about teasing the stories like I do at the top of these episodes, I couldn't quite think of sort of what the connective tissue was between them. But then I realized really what makes these stories exceptional is that they're both just excellent stories, as I'm getting hit by the heat of this fire, to be told around a campfire. But before we get into those two stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, go ahead and invite the like button to come to your campfire and cook some s'mores with you. But give them the wrong date and location. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. In the late 1990s, in rural New York, there were these two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly, and they were both very good friends. They were part of a bigger group of friends in their high school that sort of spent a lot of time together, but Rachel and Molly oftentimes were together by themselves quite a bit. And the thing that sort of drew the two together and really sort of made them friends in the first place and also drew them to that bigger group was their shared love of goth culture. So being goth, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, if you were like a high school kid, basically meant you wore all black clothes, you had like black nail polish, black lipstick, your hair's black, you sort of embraced all things dark and macabre. Some people were genuinely very into sort of like the idea of embracing the dark side of things. Other people just did it as like a fashion statement. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was definitely a thing, certainly in America. And Rachel and Molly were both very committed goths, and they just sort of loved that whole vibe. And one of the things that Rachel and Molly really liked to do as goth teenagers is they and their group of friends would go hang out in the local cemetery. Now, at first, the reason they did this was actually to sort of be ironic. It's like they were known as the goth kids in their high school, and so the idea of them hanging out in a cemetery just seemed kind of too on the nose. And so they went out there almost like a joke, the whole group of them. But they found this cemetery was kind of a cool hangout spot, and they began to really enjoy hanging out in the cemetery, and it became sort of like their go-to thing, especially on the weekends. Now, typically when Rachel, Molly, and their friends would go hang out in the cemetery, they would do so at night to sort of maximize, the darkness, really leaning into the whole goth side of things. But also, they would always go as a group. Like it was Rachel, Molly, and several other people that would be in the cemetery hanging out at one time. Like Rachel and Molly did not go there just the two of them. It was always a group. And part of the reason was it was just more enjoyable that way. But also, despite their love of spending time in the cemetery, it was still a cemetery at night, and it was, a little bit creepy. And so there was, strength in numbers, and so they liked being there with a group. It felt safer. One Friday night, Rachel was home alone when she got a call from Molly. And Molly asked her, hey, do you want to go hang out in the cemetery? And Rachel's like, duh, like, that's what we do on the weekends. I'd love to go. Like, come pick me up. Let's go. And so Rachel, she gets all ready and, she's waiting outside, and eventually Molly shows up in her car. And the first thing Rachel notices is that Molly's all alone in the car. She is not with the group that normally she would be with when they picked Rachel up. So Rachel, she walks out to the car and she climbs in and she says to Molly, like, hey, so are we now going to pick up the rest of our friends? Like, where is everybody? And Molly's like, actually, no, I tried getting in touch with everybody else, but everybody's either busy or working or hungover from last night. So it's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Like, is that okay? And Rachel admittedly did not think this was okay. Because again, like, this was not an activity that these girls did by themselves. Rachel was very close with Molly and vice versa. Like, that was fine. It's a little uncomfortable being in the cemetery without the big group. But Rachel didn't want to be rude. She sort of felt like Molly had already clearly made peace with them being alone out there. And so Rachel's like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like, it'll be great, just the two of us. Like, let's go. And so even though she sort of didn't want to, she gets in the car and they take off and they drive, the half mile to the cemetery. Now, this cemetery was enormous. It was like this massive, very old cemetery. And when you pull up to it, as they did in their car, you would first see this huge, like medieval gate, like this archway that sort of goes across the entrance to the cemetery. And like the big wrought iron gates, they're sort of permanently open, but it's this very like sort of Gothic looking, archway that you drive through. And then once you're in the cemetery, the road you're on basically cuts down the very middle of the cemetery all the way to the backside. It's huge, probably like over a mile from one side to the other. And it sort of split the cemetery into two big parts, the right and the left side as you go in. And where they, Molly, Rachel, and their friends loved to hang out was sort of, as you're driving into the cemetery, like the back left corner. And the reason they liked that area is because on the left side of the cemetery, sort of on the left-hand side, there were sort of like rolling hills that all the plots were in. And in particular, in the back left corner of the cemetery, there was like this one depression in the earth where there really weren't that many tombstones. And there was like a big boulder sitting at the bottom of the depression and a tree that was next to it. And so basically, if you were scanning across the top of the cemetery, just from the gate, looking out at the entire expanse of land, anybody that was down in that sort of depressed area in the back left corner, you basically couldn't see them. They're sort of tucked away down there with the rock and the tree. And so for, teenagers, for Rachel, Molly, and their friends, that was like a great place to hang out and kind of be away from the prying eyes of the public. And so, Rachel and Molly, they drive through this gate and they make the familiar drive right down the middle of this road all the way to the very back of the cemetery. By this point, it is getting dark outside. It's not totally dark yet, but it's pretty dark. Nobody's out at the cemetery. No one really ever was. Occasionally on the other side of the cemetery, basically on the exact opposite side from where they would hang out, sometimes the college kids that were in town, there was a university in their town, they would sometimes hop the fence on the other side, and there was like a little bonfire section, like right up against the fence in the cemetery. Totally not allowed, but they would sneak over and do that sometimes. But that was sort of rare. But other than those occasional college students over there, the cemetery was basically always vacant. And so they get to the other side, they park their car, they get out, and they walk right from the road, basically right down this it's a gentle sloping hill, but down into this depression, their hangout spot. And once they get down there, there's that big rock and the tree, and they each took up positions sitting on the rock, leaning against the tree, and then just began crushing cigarettes and just hanging out, because that's what goth teenagers in rural New York in the 1990s did. So Rachel and Molly, they're doing their thing. They're having a nice time. They're, swapping stories. They're talking about their boyfriends, about drama at school. And eventually, it gets fully dark outside and the girls are still just having a nice time. And Rachel's actually thinking to herself, like, actually, this is kind of nice. Like, this isn't scary. This is kind of cool. Like, I'm having, good one-on-one time with my buddy here. But eventually, as they're down there, they start to smell smoke. Now, remember, periodically, on the other side of the cemetery, like pretty far away, was that bonfire area that college kids sometimes would, start bonfires over there. And, when Rachel and Molly had first come into the cemetery, they had looked over there and hadn't seen a fire. But they're thinking, we've been hanging out here for quite a while. It's entirely possible that in the time we've been down here, that those kids have hopped the fence, started a fire, and that's what we're smelling. Now, the fire itself really had no bearing directly on whatever Molly and Rachel were going to do that night. I mean, they're on opposite sides of the cemetery. But Rachel and Molly knew that historically, whenever there was a bonfire over there, eventually the police would always show up, because you're not allowed to do that. And they would kick off, the kids, they'd make them put their fire out. And then always the police would do, a check of the entire cemetery. And anybody that was hanging out in there, like Molly and Rachel were, also got kicked out, even if they were not starting fires. And so Molly and Rachel, they look at each other after smelling this fire, and they both sort of have the same thought, like, we should probably just leave, before the police get here and make us leave. And, after all, they'd been there for quite a while. They were about ready to leave anyhow, so this was like no big deal. So, they put out their last cigarette, they got their stuff, and they turned and began walking back up the hill, back in the direction they had come down on, back in the direction of their car. And as they're walking up, they're expecting to crest the hill and, see their car and see the whole cemetery and, maybe way off in the distance, maybe they'll see a flicker of the bonfire that they must be smelling. But as they walk up and they see their car and they look out across the cemetery, they don't see a fire over there. Instead, basically right over to their right, 100 meters away from them, was another sort of depression in the cemetery, another rolling hill that sort of went down out of sight. And they could see basically the tops of a flickering fire in the neighboring depression, 100 meters away. Now, when they showed up, they were definitely alone on this side of the cemetery. There was nobody else here. And so clearly someone has shown up and started a fire while they were here. And they've never seen any behavior like this. This is completely unusual. No one starts fires over here. What is that? So the two girls they're curious. Did the college kids come over here to start a fire? Because again, they can only see the tops of the flames of this fire down in this neighboring depression. They can't see the person or people who are around it, but they're thinking the people over there have no idea that we are over here. And so the two girls are like, well, what if we kind of go back down to where we were and sneak up the far side of our sort of hilled in area and poke our heads over and see whose fire this is. We'll see the college kids and see what they're doing. We can spy on them or something. And the two girls are like, yeah, why not? We're already here. And so the two girls, they turn around, they walk back down into the base of their depression where the big rock and the tree was that they were just sitting on for the past couple of hours. And they walk past it basically to the other side and begin walking up that hill. And as they're getting closer and closer to the top of this hill, when eventually, once they reach the top, they could peer over and see the fire and see whoever was there. Right as they got almost to the top, Rachel sort of unintentionally makes some noise, the way she was walking, and she sort of made a sound as she stepped on something, but she accidentally makes a fair amount of noise. And the only noise in the area was the sound of the fire. They hadn't heard any voices yet. And so Rachel, she just covers her mouth and looks over at Molly, and Molly kind of looked at her what are you doing? We're sneaking up on these people. Why are you making noise? And the two girls, they just freeze for a second, waiting to see if, whoever was over there heard them and sort of reacted to the noise Rachel made. But it was silent, sort of eerily silent. And at this point, Rachel and Molly, it was the mood just shifted. They had not reached the top of the hill yet. They had not seen whoever was at this fire. But it was something just felt wrong now. And the two girls looked at each other and they're like, maybe we should just turn around and leave. And they both were like, yeah, let's get out of here. This doesn't feel right. And so right then and there, the two girls, as quietly as they could, turned and retreated back down to the center of the depression where the rock and the tree was, and they began walking back up the original side of the hill in the direction of where their car is parked at the top. And as they're walking up, Rachel just happens to turn back around where they had just been, just to look in the direction of where they had just been. And now she sees there is clearly a man standing on the ridgeline with the fire behind him, illuminating him, and he's just standing there sort of ominously staring in the direction of Rachel and Molly. And he's just not saying a word, he's just looking in their direction. Clearly he was the one over at the fire, he must have heard them. And Rachel, she whips around and she's like, Molly, look. And Molly looks and she's like, let's get out of here. We don't know who that guy is, we gotta get out of here. And so Rachel and Molly, they begin quickly walking up the hill. And then a second later, Rachel turns back around and the man is no longer on the hill, but then she sees movement and she realizes he's running down the hill in their direction. And so the girls start screaming, they start running up the hill. Rachel's constantly looking around and this guy's gaining on them. They get to the top of the hill, they charge over to Molly's car, they jump inside, they lock the doors, they fire it up and they drive off. And as they're driving, Rachel's looking out the back window and she sees this man basically looking. He's reached the road, he almost got to them. And he was looking in their direction, and as they drove off, he just slowly turned and walked back down the hill out of sight. And so Rachel and Molly, they're totally shaken up by this. Clearly that wasn't a college kid. Like that was a 40-something-year-old man who they had never seen before. Like the whole situation just felt totally just creepy and spooky, and they really didn't know what to make of it. They sort of felt like what could have happened if he reached us? Like what was he trying to do? Like what just happened? But ultimately, when they got home, or when Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, the two girls were sort of like, man, that was crazy, huh? You know, they kind of like chalked it up as like just a crazy night, you know, like, oh boy, we better, you know, stay out of there alone at night, you know, like it was just sort of a joke by the time they were done for the night. And so Rachel, you know, she goes into her house, doesn't even tell her mom. She just, you know, puts her stuff down, goes to her room, and Molly, she went to her house, and she too didn't even tell anyone. She went to bed as well. The next morning, Rachel woke up and she went downstairs into the kitchen, and her mom was in there. And her mom was just kind of doing her morning routine. And when she saw Rachel come in, she said to Rachel, like, hey, how was your night last night? And Rachel was like, oh, you know, it was fine. Me and Molly went out. It was fine. No big deal. And her mom was like, oh, did you hear what happened last night? And Rachel's like, no, what do you mean? What happened? And her mom was like, well, a woman in our town got kidnapped. And she got kidnapped from the very parking garage where I park. Like she worked in the same building as me. She got kidnapped. And Rachel's like, oh my God, like what happened to her? Like, did they find her? And Rachel's mom is like, no, unfortunately it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And in fact, whoever kidnapped and then killed her brought her body last night to the local cemetery and burned her in this huge bonfire. And whoever did it still hasn't been caught. And when Rachel heard this, it was like her whole world came crashing down, because suddenly she understood what had happened the night before. That fire was no ordinary fire. That was the killer that chased them down the hill. That fire very likely contained the woman who had been killed. They were right next to this person, this killer, and this horrible thing happening. And even more creepy is like, they were there very likely when the killer arrived, set up shop, and began burning this body, you know, no more than 100 meters away from them. And what would have happened if that man who chased them, what would have happened if he caught them? And so Rachel, she pours her heart out to her mom and tells her everything that happened the night before. And her mom is like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. You have to tell the police because they haven't caught this guy. Like, you have a description of him. Like, go talk to the police. And so sure enough, Rachel, she gets in touch with Molly and, you know, tells Molly what happened. And Molly's totally in hysterics. They can't believe what a close call this was. And they do go to the police. They tell them, you know, to the best of their ability, what they remember about this guy, which unfortunately was not much. It was like he was average height, you know, he looked to be maybe in his 40s. Like there wasn't much to their description. But fortunately, just 48 hours later, the police were able to catch this guy and he would make a full confession. Luckily, 2 days later, not really because of the girl's description at all, but just sort of by luck alone, the police happened to see the victim's car in town. Somebody was driving the victim's car around, and so they pulled this person over. It wound up being the killer who, after being arrested, did make a full confession. And so needless to say, Rachel and Molly, when they think about what happened that night in the cemetery, they feel very fortunate that Rachel sort of inadvertently made noise on their approach to go spy on the fire, which ultimately caused them both to sort of rethink their decisions and turn around and leave. It very likely saved their life. Because if that hadn't happened and they had gone over the hill and had been confronted by the killer, it's entirely possible that both those girls could have wound up in the bonfire as well. So before I became MrBallen and, you know, told stories on the internet, you know, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, I was in the military. I was a Navy SEAL for 7 years. And there was a time where I believed that was going to be my calling in life. But I ultimately got hurt, and honestly, it wasn't really a fit. So I wound up departing, and then obviously the rest is history. I became MrBallen. But, you know, I have lots of stories about my time when I was in the military. I have lots of really funny stories about training and scary stories, you know, about my actual service overseas. But one story that has always stood out to me was actually what it was like to deploy for the very first time to Afghanistan. And this is not really a war story. And that's why this story sort of stands out to me. So, I spend, years, literally almost 3 years training and becoming a Navy SEAL. And then it's like, okay, I get to my SEAL team on the East Coast in Virginia. And, so SEAL Team 2 is where I was. And we start training for our deployment. And we find out it's going to be to Afghanistan. And, this is back in 2013. And so, going to Afghanistan likely meant combat. In that time, there was still definitely active combat operations happening. And for Navy SEALs and for any direct combat unit, you do want to go to war, not because you are like a warmonger, but because that's what you train for. And so it's like, okay, like I'm getting ready for combat. And then the day comes, and the way you deploy this is not unique to Navy SEALs, but like they don't send you out to wherever you're going in one group because it's sort of risky. What if a plane crashes and your whole platoon gets wiped out, right? So you get sent out in like little batches, like sometimes on civilian flights. Like I flew first to South America with like a couple other SEALs. We're all dressed as civilians. And then we hitched a military transit flight actually into Afghanistan. But again, like my mentality as I'm getting ready for this deployment is like, okay, like this is the thing I've trained for. Like, here we go, like combat. And I remember I was on this military plane. This is the last leg actually getting into Afghanistan. And when we actually flew into Afghani airspace, which is an active war zone at the time, the pilots, the military pilots, they turned the lights inside of the aircraft from the white overhead, daytime lights to red. And then they told all of us to stay away from the windows. And the reason was we're now entering, the part of this trip where we're going to land. And in theory, the plane could get shot at. You don't want to get shot at through the window. And I mean, if you think about it, if you're getting blasted by like an RPG, it's not going to matter that like you're near a window or not. But it was sort of this stark reminder that it's like, okay, here we go. Like we're about to enter a war zone. And then the way these planes would land is they needed to basically cut down the amount of time they were within small arms range. So the lower you get, the more, sort of exposed the plane is. And so the way they'd land is they would take these really steep descents and basically like fly straight down and then land really abruptly. It was like sort of gnarly. And so we're coming in for this crazy landing. The red lights are on, everyone's tucked away from the windows. And I'm like, okay, we're getting ready for Afghanistan. And we touch down. And it's a successful landing, and now we're in this like pretty well fortified base. Shank is what it was called. And I remember the back of the plane opened up after we sort of had stopped taxiing. We came to a stop, and the back of the plane opened up. And remember, my mentality is like, okay, we're going to war, right? And I grabbed my pack. The rest of my stuff had been packed on pallets and sent weeks prior. So all I have is a backpack. And me and a buddy of mine, another guy on my team, we walk out the runway, and we basically see Afghanistan really for the first time, because I really had the windows on the airplane, by the way, were like these little portholes. You really never got a good look, not to mention we had to avoid the windows. So this is like my first view of Afghanistan. And I remember just like looking around, and it was just unbelievably beautiful. Like Afghanistan is shockingly beautiful. It's in every direction, 360 degrees, these just enormous, like massive snow-covered mountains and just beautiful fields. It's like untouched land. And like we're in the middle of this like jagged scar across the earth, which is this like NATO base where war is sort of launched out of. But it's like you're looking around at just this unbelievably beautiful place. And it was like in such contrast to what I believed I was coming here for, or what I was there for, like to fight in a war. And it just like didn't compute. Like this is too beautiful a place to be having a war fought. But I mean, very quickly after sort of seeing this environment and being like, oh my gosh, we were quickly ushered over to this like holding area, and we had to grab our stuff. And then before long, we had jumped into these very up-armored military vehicles called RGs, which are like 50,000 ton anti-IED vehicles. Basically, if it detonates underneath you, in theory, you'll survive. And out we go, from the base we were on out to this like very forward operating base that was sort of out in the sticks. And it was like sort of a vulnerable spot. And it was where we were going to be operating from for the next 6 months. Our mission was pretty vulnerable. We were out sort of actually actively fighting the war. But that first night, we get to our actual base, this very stripped down, like very vulnerable spot out in the middle of nowhere. And when we got there, there were the previous team was still there. They were wrapping up their deployment. And there were interpreters who are a central part of the warfighting effort, from our side. And a lot of these interpreters who are pretty young, like in their 20s, like they've been out there working with various units that have come through those bases for years. And because they're working with NATO, they don't have a place outside of the base. Like they're targeted by the Taliban and other sort of militant groups because, they're working for NATO. They're traitors, And so the great promise for these interpreters is that by working with NATO, eventually they'll be given the opportunity to leave Afghanistan and come to the United States. And for some people that's true. Not true for everybody, but these interpreters are like hard as nails. They've been in so many gunfights. Like these people have seen some crazy stuff. And my role was to work with these interpreters. I was going to be someone that worked with our partner force. And so I get to this little outstation. It's late at night and it's sort of overwhelming, this whole thing. The team that was already there, SEAL Team 8, they were like, so like cowboy by this point. They'd been in combat now for the last 6 months. They're all just like jacked and huge beards. Like they could care less about anything. And I'm like super green. And I went and I met with one of our interpreters to like sort of give me a lay of the land of what to expect over the next couple of days. And so we talked about some operations we'd likely do and sort of, got to know each other a little bit. But at some point, one of these interpreters, the guy I was talking to, who maybe was like 25, 26, and I was in my 20s too, he said to me, he goes, bro, and they all talk in like Western slang. Like their English is like rugged, like American military slang because they're around like 18-year-old Marines 24/7. He's like, bro, have you heard the story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? Now we were in a different part of Afghanistan, but he was referencing Kandahar, Afghanistan. And what I would come to find out is there was this story about a giant, like a creature, some huge creature that lived in a cave out in the mountains of Kandahar. And like Afghanistan, again, is this huge, just like mountains everywhere. And there are all these cave systems up in these mountains, some of which are like untouched by humanity. And this Terp was like, bro, I'm telling you, it's real. Like there was a giant up in the caves in Kandahar. Like, have you heard about this? Like, I want to know more. The interpreter did. And so, we didn't really talk much more than that, but it was planted in my mind that there was like this real belief by this interpreter that there was like some truth to this, what sounded like sort of a folklore, this crazy story about a giant in a cave. And so it stuck with me. It stuck with me that I'd heard that story. Fast forward, years later, I'm out of the military and I've become MrBallen. I've begun telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. And I was thinking about what stories I wanted to tell. This was like in the very early days of having the channel. And I suddenly remembered like the Kandahar giant. And I was like, man, I want to look into that and see if there's any truth to what my interpreter was getting at. And sure enough, I found like this treasure trove of testimony from this special operations group, the Green Berets, that apparently did. Like this one particular group of Green Berets that apparently came in touch with something otherworldly up in the caves of Kandahar. And in particular, there was one soldier who just went by Mr. K because he was worried about his name getting out there, who gave just like shocking testimony about what they saw. And so I felt like I needed to do this story justice. I wanted to sort of compile the notes and put together a story that, sort of picked up where my interpreter had began. And I told the story years and years ago. And tonight, I'm going to tell you that story again. So in 2002, there was this Army infantry unit that was out doing a patrol in the Kandahar mountain range. And again, you got to picture just massive snow-covered mountains. I mean, this is a huge area. And, a lot of times in 2002, these patrols, you'd be sort of looking potentially for cave systems where Taliban fighters would be camping out, or, sometimes there'd be fighters that were down in the valleys below. But these patrols were fairly routine for NATO in 2002. And so this unit, they're out on patrol, and generally the way it works, really independent of what branch of the military you're in the US military, when you're out on patrol, you basically update some level of higher command as you're doing the operation. And also, by the way, virtually no operations, no matter how routine or mundane, like no operations aren't planned out. Like everything is planned. Like what time you get there, how long you're going to be there, what you're trying to do, when you're going to leave, what platform you're going to use to leave. Like everything is really coordinated. And so this unit, they went out, for the, umpteenth time to do this patrol. And at some point in the middle of this patrol, the higher command lost contact with them. And the reason this immediately stood out as problematic is, it wasn't totally unusual for a group to lose comms. I mean, you're trying to communicate across huge mountain ranges, using, these radios that are really a lot of times not that great. And so losing comms is not that unusual. But generally speaking, like a lot of times if you lose comms, you get it back pretty quickly. And so there had been a pretty long period of time where no one could get in touch with this unit. And then on top of that, as higher command was beginning to figure out like what we should do here, should we send out a quick reaction force to go find them? Should we send, air assets overhead to go try to look for them that way? As they're thinking about that, somebody realized that not only had they suddenly gone silent, this huge infantry unit, but also they had not called in a TIC before they went silent. So a TIC, or Troops in Contact, is the acronym for basically being in a gunfight. And the reason this is important is, when you're in a combat zone, your higher command doesn't automatically know if you're getting shot at or if you're in an active gunfight. You need to call it in. And the reason you call it in is because you may need huge help. You might want air assets to come in and save the day. You might need a medevac. You might need reinforcements. And so basically the instant you start getting shot at, commanders on the ground, or whoever's on the ground, could be someone super junior, they'll call into higher command and say, troops in contact, tick, 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 tick. And the reason they do that is basically to have help on standby. Now they're like, okay, we know something's going down, we're ready to support. And in fact, what we saw when we were in Afghanistan is, if anything, we were like too quick to call in a TIC, because it's sort of like a cheat code, right? Like, oh, I think I heard gunfire way over there, call in a TIC. And then immediately you got like warthogs overhead and crazy assets everywhere, like you're totally protected. Well, we sort of took advantage of it. And a lot of people did. Like, it's rare for the reverse to happen. Like, people are not conservative calling this in. And so for an entire unit to suddenly go like silent, having not called in a TIC, it's either a huge like radio problem, but that usually gets resolved relatively quickly, or it's something else, something that is just harder to define because it just doesn't really happen very much. And so after a certain amount of time had passed, when still no one could get in touch with this unit, ultimately the Army decided this was, a big enough deal. There was enough people in that unit that were now unaccounted for, that they decided to send in an elite military unit to try to find them. And so they tapped this Green Beret unit. So the Army's top special forces team, the Green Berets, they grabbed a group of those guys and said, you go out into the mountains of Kandahar to their last known location and figure out what happened to them. And one of the people that was in this detachment of Green Berets was Mr. K, one of the people that gave pretty incredible testimony that I'm about to relay to you right now. So Mr. K and the rest of his small group of Green Berets, they hop on helicopters and they fly out to this section of Kandahar where, this infantry unit was last. And they touch down, and you got to understand that this is like rural as rural can be. There is, no people. Like, there's no cities, no nothing. There's like mud huts periodically, but it's just like mountains. You kind of feel like sometimes when you're in Afghanistan that you're like almost on a different planet. And so they touch down and they look around and they see nobody. Like there's no locals. There's certainly no, American military or NATO. It's just like a wasteland in all directions. And they know that the area they're searching is pretty sizable and it's very mountainous. So it's going to be like a very rough several days of basically hiking through the mountains trying to find any sign of this unit. And so they touch down, and they all have like extremely heavy packs on. I mean, you got all your ammo, your equipment. Like, this is a rugged thing they're doing. And they start hiking through the mountains. Based on the brief that unit had given before they stepped out for this mission, they sort of had a rough idea, Mr. K and his unit, of the direction of travel. And so they're sort of following that direction. But as they're hiking through the mountains, I mean, the unit that Mr. K was a part of, they didn't find anybody. And for several days, I mean, they're out there in the mountains just hiking all day. You know, they came into contact a couple of times with the enemy, but there wasn't even any ticks or anything. It was just like at a distance, like, oh, there's some fighters over there. But they're on a mission to find these missing soldiers. So they're not trying to engage with anybody else. Like, they're just hiking and looking for any sign of this unit. But again, for a few days, they couldn't find anything. Finally, though, on the 4th day of this rescue mission, so during the daytime, Mr. K and his team, they're walking along the mountain range, and they decide to take this goat trail that they can see right ahead of them. It sort of goes up and over the top of this mountain. They decide, okay, we're just gonna take that goat trail and see what's on the other side. You know, there wasn't any clear agenda for why this goat trail was of interest, but they're like, oh, you know, everywhere else we're walking is just rugged and awful. At least this goat trail, a literal trail made by goats running along this area, is easier to walk on. So let's take that, we'll follow it to the other side, and we'll see what's up there. You know, and also we'll be up higher and we can maybe get a view down into the valley on the other side, and maybe we'll see something. And so Mr. K and the rest of the Green Berets began making their way up this goat trail, which sort of, you know, meandered its way up and then eventually onto the other side. And as they're walking up, they start to notice these little bits of plastic and metal sort of strewn about on the trail. And at first, as they're walking, they don't actually know what they are. But as they keep moving, they start to realize that these are parts of military equipment. Like, these are parts of radios and other stuff that would definitely belong to, for example, an infantry unit. And so now, like, Mr. K and the others, they got their rifles sort of ready to go. They're walking up more apprehensively because they're thinking, like, this is obviously connected to what we're looking for. Like, who knows what we're gonna find once we cross the top of this mountain? Like, are we gonna find like a bloodbath? Are we gonna find the missing unit waiting for us? Like, they don't know. And so they continue walking up this trail, and as they get higher and higher, they find bigger and bigger pieces of military equipment on the ground, like whole military backpacks, like bigger chunks of radios. And then also they began finding bits of uniform, like military uniforms that even in some cases still had like name tags and patches on them. And they were able to see very clearly that those uniforms, at least, definitely belonged to the specific unit they were looking for. So they know, like, they've discovered their first real lead here, and it doesn't look good. And so up the goat trail they go, and they finally get to the very top. And I say this, you know, I'm trying not to be biased because obviously I was a Navy SEAL and I think very highly of US Special Operations and their training. But, you know, Green Berets and Navy SEALs, they're very different and definitely do different jobs. But in many ways they are peers, certainly in terms of like the rigor of training. And one of the things that is just absolutely true, and I've seen it in combat, is that when stuff gets wild, like in a combat scenario, in a dangerous scenario, these Green Berets would have absolutely fallen into their training like flawlessly. This would not have been, no matter how crazy or how insane whatever they saw on the other side of the mountain, whatever it was going to be, they were ready for it. And so they would have been like dialed in, making their way up the mountain, getting ready to handle whatever's up there. And so, you know, Mr. K and his team, they make their way to the very top of this goat trail. And when they crested the top, what they saw was like this plateau. So it wasn't like a peak, it was like this flat section of the mountain. And actually there was another section of the mountain that sort of went up beyond the plateau, and there were these huge like cave entrances that sort of basically fed out. These 3 cave entrances fed out onto this plateau, as if it was like the plateau was the front porch and the cave entrances are like the doors that lead into this upper section of the mountain. And on this plateau, scattered all over the place, is not just, you know, more pieces of military equipment, but also pretty obviously human bones, or what appeared to be human bones, like scattered about. And there was, you know, no living people up here. The missing unit was definitely not up here. But it looked like if they were up here, I mean, something horrible happened to them. And so once they reached the plateau, again, you got a picture like this elite military unit, they would have immediately taken up positions all around this plateau because they know these cave entrances have to be explored. You have to see who's inside of there. Like, Is the missing unit in there? Are the remaining survivors taking shelter in there? Are there combatants in there? And so Mr. K and his unit, they sort of detailed taking up positions, getting ready to engage if they had to. And then once they were in position, Mr. K and the guy he was next to, his shooting buddy, if you will, were tapped to go up to the entrance of one of these caves and just look inside. And so silently they got up and they walked across this plateau while the rest of the team is sort of looking outward and also looking in. So there's 360-degree security. So Mr. K, he walks up along with his shooting buddy, and he said he looked into this entrance, this huge, massive entrance, like could easily just walk into this opening, but it's totally dark inside. And so he goes into the cave, and once he gets in there, like it's very dark, and he's sort of trying to look inside to see if he can see anything. And it does go back a little ways, but he barely takes a couple of steps into the cave when he realizes like there's like this sheer cliff within the cave. Like you basically walk in and then it shoots straight down. And Mr. K, he caught himself and he looked down to see if he could see what was down sort of in this pit within the cave, but it was just too dark, he couldn't see anything. And then, like as he's standing back up again, getting ready to sort of assess what he should do next, he sees like a flash of movement in the far backside of the cave, basically beyond this crevasse that he can't cross. And so Mr. K instinctively raises his gun like he's ready to engage whatever this is, but before he can, this enormous spear, like a massive javelin, comes soaring out of the cave and impales the shooting buddy. His name was Dan, the other Green Beret that was next to Mr. K, who went up to explore the cave. The spear impales him, sends him flying back, and this is in plain view of all the other Green Berets. They all see this happen, and then like in the space of a few seconds, this massive, just enormous human creature, this like 12-foot tall thing, comes bounding out of the cave, clears the crevasse, and charges out onto the plateau. And it sort of looked like a huge person, but again, it's like 12 feet tall. It's got 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. It's wearing various animal skins, got this huge red hair, red beard, and it runs out to, presumably attack the Green Berets. But immediately they just start shooting it, and in like seconds, this massive creature falls to the ground, dead. And so at this point, like after the creature is down, I mean, nobody knows what to make of this, but again, it's like they fall back into their training. They immediately, once they know the threat is down and there's nobody else coming out of the cave, they run over to Dan to provide, life-saving care. But Dan's dead. I mean, he was killed by this javelin. And so now the team, they poked their head into the cave to make sure there wasn't anybody else, but as far as they knew, there wasn't. And for sure, this giant was dead. And so like they hadn't found the missing military unit, but now they have a casualty and like they have this horrible thing that's happened. And so one of the team leads for this Green Beret team, they end up calling higher command and they say, hey, you got to come get us. Like we can't even tell you what just happened, but we have a man down, killed in action, and we have this combatant, this creature, we don't even know what to call it, but you got to get out here and you got to take this thing too. We don't even know what it is. And so not long after, 2 helos showed up, and one of them was to transport the Green Berets and to transport Dan back to the base. And then the other helo had this huge net that they basically wrapped around this dead, huge giant, and they strapped it up to the underside of the helo, and then they flew off with this giant. And, Mr. K and his unit, they expected to be brought back to base and to basically debrief the mission, which, in layman's terms means you basically talk through what actually happened and you sort of put it down in your after action report, like what happened, what mistakes were made, what did we do, like you basically put it on the record, like what happened. And you do it typically like right afterwards. Even if you've had like a casualty, you immediately document what's happened. And so they go back to base expecting not only to tell their story about seeing this giant, if you will, but to maybe get some clarification about what the heck just happened. Like, they wanted some more information, but when they got back to base and they did their after action report, which they sort of did on their own, nobody came to talk to them. The unit was sort of pushed off to the side and told to just, write down what you saw and just leave it at that. After they wrote it all down and they included, the truth, everybody on the team saw what they saw, they were told by higher command that they actually could not publish those details in their after action report, and they had to change it. Like we can't say you fought a giant in a cave. We can't say that. Like, there's no way that's true. You can't say it. And so Mr. K and his team, like, despite knowing it wasn't true, they went and they changed the report. And they just said they came in contact with the enemy, and the enemy, through small arms fire, killed Dan. And then after they submitted this, erroneous report, they were then told to sign all these non-disclosure agreements to basically say they would not talk about what they actually saw in that cave. And after that, Dan and the rest of his unit, they were basically told, you can't talk about this. This is too sensitive. And they even went looking for more information about it. And they found that all of the reporting in Afghanistan around that time about that operation had been heavily redacted. Mr. K never even found out what happened to the missing unit that they had gone out looking for. Like, it was just this big mystery. But fast forward 14 years to 2016, and Mr. K just felt like he didn't want to keep this a secret anymore. And he spoke to some other members of his team that were there, and they too were just like really shaken up by what happened and just felt like it was wrong that nobody knew. And so that's what ultimately prompted Mr. K to go public with his story. And also, when he went public, what he also discovered is that other people sort of in the military hierarchy also had some level of exposure to this giant. What Mr. K would discover is that after the giant had been hoisted in that net by that helo and flown off somewhere, apparently it had been brought to an airfield in Afghanistan, another NATO base, and pilots that were going to be transporting this to another base remember seeing this 12 to 15 foot tall giant looking person with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot in this net. They remember seeing it and actually describing it in their after action report. And they would say they were told not to include those details. And those details were redacted and made top secret. And so basically Mr. K, after coming forward, quickly learned through the grapevine that basically everybody affiliated with the giant was told not to talk about it. And the government basically shut it down, redacted it, and made it top secret. Now, I don't really know what to make of this story. There's a part of me that does want to believe that, the testimony of Mr. K is totally legitimate. But there's also a part of me that knows that, this could all just be made up. But a lot of people claim to have seen this thing. And I remember so distinctly, my own interpreter back in 2013 being so convinced that there was something in the caves in Kandahar, and he really wanted to know more about it. It's like, there's some level of truth to this. I was, in Afghanistan, and I was in the mountains of Afghanistan, not Kandahar. I was in Logar. But we used to walk by and look up and see these cave entrances, and I gotta tell you, it's unsettling. Who knows what's inside of those things? It doesn't seem entirely impossible that a giant could be in there, Like, this is a landscape that's just, it's different. It's like a different planet out there. But, really what you're left with here is you have an entire infantry unit that's still unaccounted for, at least publicly, and you have an Army Green Beret in Dan who was killed in front of his team, and they want answers. And, it's like what you see is the government apparently went to great lengths to cover up what happened, or to at least disguise the truth. Whether or not they're covering something up remains to be seen, but I think there's more to this story that we simply don't know. But I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, so why don't you let me know in the comments and I'll get back to as many people as I can. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never before heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. All right, thank you all so much for joining me tonight at the campfire. And if you enjoyed this, remember, we actually have a whole playlist of campfire episodes that are ready for you to binge right now. If you want to do that, go ahead and click right here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.